When people talk about Michael Jackson, they usually focus on the spectacle, record-breaking albums, global tour, and a level of fame few human beings have ever experienced. But behind that public image was someone who grew up under constant scrutiny, with very little space to develop emotionally in a normal way. From a young age, he lived in a world where approval was tied to performance. Every note, every move, every appearance had to be perfect. In that kind of environment, emotional safety becomes rare. And when it does appear, it leaves a lasting imprint. For Michael, one of the earliest sources of that emotional safety came in the form of Diana Ross, a figure who would remain deeply significant in his life for decades. At the time they met, Diana Ross was already a major force in the music industry. As the lead singer of the Supremes and later a solo star, she represented confidence, control, and elegance. In contrast, Michael was still a child navigating a demanding career shaped largely by family expectations and industry pressures. Their connection formed during the era of Motown Records, where young Michael was introduced to a professional world that moved fast and demanded even faster growth. While industry figures like Berry Gordy recognized his talent, Diana's role felt different to him, less transactional, more personal. That distinction would shape how Michael remembered her presence for the rest of his life. Michael later described Diana Ross as someone who made him feel seen in a way others didn't. This wasn't necessarily about career guidance or musical training, it was about emotional recognition. In a childhood where discipline and perfection were emphasized, moments of simple encouragement could carry enormous weight. Diana, by many accounts, treated him with a kind of warmth that stood out. She spoke to him as if he mattered beyond his talent. For a child performer, that difference can be profound. It's not surprising that Michael began to associate her with comfort, stability, and a sense of belonging that was otherwise missing from his early life. As their bond developed, Michael spent time around Diana in more informal settings, including her home. These experiences exposed him to a different version of adulthood, one that wasn't defined by strict control or constant pressure. He observed how she carried herself, how she communicated, and how she maintained authority without harshness. These impressions mattered. For someone still forming his identity, Diana became more than just a mentor, she became a reference point. Over time, he began referring to her as mother in an emotional sense, not as a literal replacement, but as a reflection of how safe he felt in her presence. It's important to understand that this kind of attachment doesn't always follow clear boundaries, especially for someone who grew up in an unconventional environment. Michael's early life didn't offer much opportunity for typical emotional development. Relationships were often tied to work expectations and outcomes. In that context, Diana Ross represented something different, an emotional space that didn't require performance. That alone can create a powerful bond. Over time, admiration can evolve into something deeper, not necessarily romantic, but more complex than a standard mentor relationship. As Michael entered his teenage years, his perception of Diana began to shift. She was no longer just a comforting presence, she became an ideal. He studied her confidence, her voice, and her ability to command attention. This wasn't unusual for a young artist learning from a successful figure, but in Michael's case, the admiration carried a strong emotional layer. He didn't just want to learn from her, he wanted to understand her, to mirror aspects of her identity. For someone searching for stability, attaching that sense of identity to a single figure can feel grounding, even if it later becomes complicated. 7. Those close to Michael noticed how often he spoke about Diana. She wasn't just part of his professional journey, she was part of how he defined success, beauty, and emotional security. He reportedly kept photos of her, referenced her in conversations, and compared others to her in ways that suggested deep admiration. These behaviors reflected more than casual respect. They pointed to a strong emotional influence that extended into multiple areas of his life, including how he viewed relationships and self-worth. Their collaborations in public appearances and performances further reinforced this connection. Being on stage or on television with Diana provided Michael with something rare: approval that didn't feel conditional. In an industry where praise often comes with expectations, that kind of validation can feel especially meaningful. It allowed him to experience success without the same pressure he was used to, at least momentarily. That contrast likely deepened his emotional reliance on her presence. However, as Michael's fame grew, so did his sense of isolation. Global success doesn't necessarily translate into personal fulfillment. In many cases, it creates distance from normal experiences, from genuine relationships, and even from oneself. For Michael, this isolation made early emotional connections even more significant. Diana remained a constant figure, someone who had known him before the world fully transformed him into a global icon. That continuity gave her a unique place in his life. At the same time, Diana Ross had her own evolving life, her career, her family, and her personal relationships. This is where the dynamic becomes more complex. While Michael's attachment may have remained consistent or even intensified, Diana's role could not remain fixed in the same way. She was not just a symbolic figure in his life, she was an individual with her own priorities. This difference in perspective likely created moments of imbalance, even if they were not openly discussed. By adulthood, Michael's descriptions of Diana reflected this complexity. At different times, he referred to her as a mother figure, a close friend, and even hinted at deeper emotional feelings. These overlapping labels can seem contradictory, but they reveal how he experienced relationships, not in clearly defined categories, but as layered emotional connections. For him, Diana embodied multiple roles simultaneously, which made the bond difficult to explain in simple terms. There were moments when Michael publicly expressed strong affection for Diana, sometimes in ways that blurred traditional boundaries. He spoke about her with admiration that extended beyond mentorship, occasionally describing her in terms that suggested emotional intensity. Whether this was interpreted as romantic or symbolic often depended on the observer. What's clear is that Michael's feelings were deeply rooted and not easily categorized. At the same time, Diana Ross maintained a degree of independence in how she engaged with him. She appreciated his admiration and supported him at various points, but she did not necessarily define the relationship in the same way. This difference may have contributed to an ongoing sense of ambiguity. For someone like Michael, who valued emotional clarity, that ambiguity could be difficult to process. This dynamic, one person seeking deeper emotional certainty while the other maintains flexibility, is not uncommon in complex relationships. But in Michael's case, the intensity of his experiences amplified everything. His emotional world operated on extremes. When he trusted fully. When he connected deeply. That made any form of uncertainty feel more significant than it might for someone with a more conventional upbringing. Despite these complexities, Diana remained a supportive figure during key moments in Michael's life. She defended him publicly at times and continued to acknowledge their connection. This ongoing presence reinforced the idea that, regardless of how the relationship was defined, it held lasting importance for both of them. It wasn't something that simply faded away with time. From a broader perspective, their relationship highlights how early emotional experiences can shape long-term connections. When someone provides comfort during formative years, that role can become deeply embedded. It's not just about the person themselves, it's about what they represent. For Michael, Diana represented safety, recognition, and a sense of identity that he struggled to find elsewhere. Understanding this context helps explain why their bond remained relevant even as their lives moved in different directions. It wasn't based solely on shared experiences or professional collaboration. It was rooted in emotional memory, and emotional memory tends to persist even when circumstances change. Over time, the public narrative around their relationship often focused on speculation, trying to define it in clear terms. But the reality may be that it never fit neatly into any single category. It evolved, shifted, and adapted to different stages of their lives. That fluidity is part of what makes it so difficult to fully interpret. For Michael Jackson, who spent much of his life under intense public scrutiny, some relationships remained intentionally undefined. Not everything was meant to be explained. In some cases, leaving things unspoken may have been a way to preserve their meaning without reducing them to labels or assumptions. In the end, the connection between Michael Jackson and Diana Ross can be understood less as a fixed definition and more as an ongoing emotional thread, one that began in childhood and continued in different forms throughout his life. Whether viewed as mentorship, friendship, or something more complex, it clearly held significance. And sometimes, the most important relationships are the ones that resist simple explanation. As Michael Jackson moved further into adulthood, his life became increasingly defined by global success. Albums, tour, and public appearances elevated him to a level of fame that few artists have ever experienced. Yet with that success came a deeper sense of isolation. The larger his public image grew, the smaller his private world seemed to become. In that shrinking emotional space, certain relationships carried more weight than others. Among them, his connection with Diana Ross remained uniquely significant. But as both of their lives evolved, maintaining the same emotional closeness became more difficult, and that shift introduced new tensions. One of the central challenges in their relationship was the difference in how each of them navigated independence. Diana Ross had already built a life that balanced career, family, and personal relationships. She was used to moving forward, adapting, and maintaining boundaries when necessary. Michael, on the other hand, often approached relationships with an all-or-nothing intensity. For him, emotional closeness was not something easily compartmentalized. When he connected with someone, he did so completely. This difference in emotional approach meant that as Diana's life expanded in different directions, Michael sometimes experienced that natural distance as something more personal. Reports and interviews over the years suggest that Michael occasionally struggled with feelings of jealousy when Diana formed relationships with other men. It's important to view this not through a sensational lens, but through the context of emotional dependency. For Michael, Diana represented stability and familiarity in a world that was constantly changing. Seeing her invest time and attention elsewhere may have felt less like a normal part of life and more like a disruption of something he considered foundational. That doesn't necessarily mean the relationship was romantic in a traditional sense, but it does highlight how deeply he valued her presence. Jealousy in this context wasn't simply about romance, it was about emotional priority. Michael had spent years placing Diana at the center of his internal world. When that position appeared to shift, even slightly, it created discomfort. This is a dynamic that can occur in many relationships, especially when one person relies heavily on another for emotional grounding. In Michael's case, the intensity of his upbringing and career likely amplified those feelings, making them harder to manage or express in conventional ways. At the same time, Diana Ross did not completely withdraw from his life. She remained present during important moments, offering support and at times public defense. This ongoing involvement may have reinforced the connection, even as the nature of their relationship evolved. From Michael's perspective, this could create mixed signals, moments of closeness followed by periods of distance. Such patterns can be confusing, particularly for someone who values consistency and clarity in emotional bonds. Public appearances sometimes reflected this complexity. When they were seen together at events, there was often a visible familiarity between them, comfort, humor, and a shared history that was difficult to overlook. For audiences, these interactions could appear warm and playful. But for Michael, those same moments may have carried deeper emotional significance. Being around Diana in a public setting might have reminded him of earlier times when their connection felt more stable and clearly defined. As Michael attempted to build relationships outside of this dynamic, he faced additional challenges. Being one of the most recognizable figures in the world made it difficult to form connections based on trust alone. Every interaction carried the possibility of public scrutiny or misunderstanding. In that environment, returning to a familiar figure like Diana Ross could feel easier, even if the relationship itself was complicated. Familiarity often provides comfort, even when it comes with unresolved emotions. There were also moments when Diana appeared to re-enter Michael's life during periods of vulnerability. Whether through public support or private communication, her presence during difficult times reinforced the idea that their bond remained intact. This pattern, distance followed by reconnection, can strengthen emotional ties over time. It creates a cycle where separation never feels final and closure is never fully reached. From a psychological perspective, this kind of dynamic can be difficult to navigate. When a relationship alternates between closeness and distance, it can lead to uncertainty about where things truly stand. For Michael, who often sought emotional clarity, this uncertainty may have been particularly challenging. It's not necessarily about assigning blame, but about understanding how different emotional needs can shape the same relationship in very different ways. Another layer to consider is how Michael's public identity influenced his private experiences. As a global icon, he was constantly surrounded by people, yet genuine emotional connections were rare. That contrast can intensify the importance of certain relationships. Diana Ross wasn't just someone from his past, she was someone who had known him before the height of his fame. That history gave her a level of credibility and trust that few others could match. At times, Michael spoke about relationships in ways that suggested he was searching for something stable and lasting. His comments often reflected a desire for loyalty, understanding, and emotional security. While he explored different connections over the years, none seemed to fully replace the role Diana played in his life. This doesn't necessarily mean that he was unable to move on, but rather that some bonds leave a deeper imprint than others. It's also worth noting that Diana Ross maintained her own perspective throughout all of this. She continued to live her life independently, making choices that aligned with her own priorities. From her point of view, the relationship with Michael may have been one of many meaningful connections, rather than a central emotional anchor. This difference in perspective is key to understanding why the dynamic sometimes felt unbalanced. Observers and biographers have often tried to define the nature of their relationship more precisely, but those interpretations vary widely. Some frame it as mentorship, others as deep friendship, and some suggest a more emotionally layered connection. The truth likely exists somewhere in between. What matters most is not fitting the relationship into a specific category, but recognizing the impact it had on both individuals, especially on Michael. As time went on, Michael appeared to become more private about his feelings. Interviews became less revealing, and he spoke less frequently about personal relationships in detail. This shift could be seen as a form of self-protection. When emotions are difficult to explain or risk being misunderstood, silence can feel like the safest option. For someone under constant media attention, maintaining that privacy can be especially important. Despite the complexities, there was no clear break between them. Unlike some relationships that end abruptly, this one seemed to continue in a quieter, less defined way. They remained connected through shared history and occasional interaction. This kind of ongoing connection can be both comforting and challenging as it leaves certain questions unresolved. In many ways, their relationship reflects a broader theme in Michael Jackson's life: the search for stability in an unstable environment. Whether through friendships, family, or mentorship, he often gravitated toward figures who represented a sense of grounding. Diana Ross happened to be one of the earliest and most enduring of those figures, which made her influence particularly strong. Understanding this period of Michael's life requires looking beyond surface-level interpretations. It's not just about who he spent time with or what was said publicly. It's about how those experiences shaped his emotional landscape. Relationships are not always defined by clear boundaries or mutual expectations. Sometimes, they exist in a space that is meaningful precisely because it cannot be easily explained. For Diana Ross, maintaining a connection with Michael may have been a natural extension of their shared history. She had witnessed his growth from a young performer to a global icon. Supporting him, even intermittently, could be seen as part of that long-standing relationship. From her perspective, this involvement may not have required constant presence or clear definition. For Michael, however, the meaning of that connection likely remained deeply personal. It represented continuity in a life that was often marked by change. Even when circumstances shifted, the emotional significance of their bond did not simply disappear. That persistence is what made the relationship so influential, even during periods of distance. Ultimately, this phase of their relationship highlights the challenges of balancing emotional attachment with personal independence. It shows how two people can share a meaningful connection while experiencing it in very different ways. For Michael Jackson, that difference may have been a source of both comfort and confusion, an ongoing dynamic that shaped how he approached relationships for years to come.